I am Grant Hagiya from the Los Angeles area, and I have the perk of also overseeing Hawaii. So if you have, we want good pastors, but if you want to come west. I'm going to talk a little bit about courage, such an important virtue for us, and I want to start out with the fact that as a young child, I've been fascinated with dinosaurs. And I got a dinosaur book before I could read. And I would look at the pictures every day and have my parents read me the text at night. And I think I knew the word Stegosaurus before my sister's real name, Sharon. And the fascination continued in really all my life, but in young adulthood, I always wondered how the largest and most huge species to ever roam the face of the earth would disappear evolutionary in such a short time span. And now we know that the prevailing theory is a huge asteroid hit the earth. And we know that this is true because of the deposits of iridium in the Yucatan Peninsula, and it's been pretty much proven that this is the prevailing theory, that it caused such environmental destruction that debris and dust was sent into the air, obscured the sun, photosynthesis couldn't take place, mass vegetation died, and with it, the sustainability of these beautiful, massive creatures could not adapt to the kind of environmental change around them. Now, that's their theory. There's a couple other theories in an attempt for humor, and that is, this is one real reason that the dinosaurs might have gone extinct. And just because it's an election year, I would throw this in from the New Yorker. I don't know if you could read it. It says, "I blame the media." But what we are facing is this huge environmental change that has forever altered the internal change that the dinosaurs faced that could not adapt to it. Now, we are in the same boat as the church. We are facing this huge environmental change of which we call secularism in North America and Europe. And with it has come declining numbers on our part that we are in angst about. It is the fact that the numbers, which we just learned are not important to us, are so stark a reality in our midst. And if you stay with me on the analogy of the dinosaurs, we have a structure that has systems and programs and structures that were from the 50s and 60s, from our grandparents and parents, that believed in institutions, that built the institutions, and handed it off to us, who were not that interested, but we inherited them and had to continue them. And now we have a number of generations who don't care anything about institutions, do not want to affiliate with those institutions at all. And this is causing our problem. And in moving to a postmodern world, we've moved to a post-religious institutional society. But here's the thing, folks. This is not our fault. We didn't create the secular world. We didn't create secularism that's raging across our US and Europe. And I think we need to stop beating ourselves for an environmental change that we didn't create. That's not our fault. So I hope you will not chide yourself for falling numbers or having to deal with the crunch of losing members. Now, what is on us, though, is, do we have the capacity from this massive structure we call the United Methodist Church to adapt and change? And that clearly is on us. A great book that I want to recommend for you, actually, this is the reaction, I think, from our part. Before I get to the book, it's in the sequence of slides. This is what we're doing right now, is a sense of fortifying ourselves against the prevailing forces. And instead of doing what we should do is turn outward, we're turning inward. And that's totally against the missional direction that we need to take right now. And so the real question for us is, are we able to adapt now? It's creating a general state of fear and anxiety when you couple this with the social issues, especially the issue of homosexuality, which I believe is a symptom rather than a cause of our discomfort. And if we do believe in family systems theory, which Edwin Freeman really detailed for us, we know that this is an expression that there will be acting out when the anxiety reaches such a level. There will be acting out on the part of individuals who cannot handle the stress of the anxiety. And we're seeing that in every quarter of our church, aren't we? In the West, I received a complaint from a Western jurisdiction member against the entire college, all active bishops and most of the retirees. Now, there's no mechanism in the discipline for a complaint against everyone. Thank God, actually. And I had this difficult conversation, I thought was a difficult conversation, by calling up the complainant and talking with him. I thought it was going to be anger and a lot of venom. And in actuality, it was one of the most civil, constructive conversations that I have had lately. You know, he wasn't doing this out of anger. He was doing this because he didn't know what else to do. And he was so distressed by this. This was one way that he thought would be constructive. And after talking with him, the commonality, the bond of relationship started to kick in. He knew all about my family. He knew my daughter was a CrossFit athlete, and it just turned the whole conversation around. So, the craziness that has been acting out, though, is a symptom of what we're facing. So here's the book that I would recommend, Robert P. Jones, The End of White Christian America, which is a must-read from everybody in this room, because he chronicles the historical and statistical understanding of the end of white Christianity in America, and really provides an understanding of our mainline decline, but also the decline of the white evangelical church, who doesn't believe it yet. And I think neither do we. So, this is a slogan, actual country western song. That is the Greater Northwest slogan, and we use this always. This is the actual lyric: God is great, the beer is good, and people are crazy. And we evoke this on a regular basis in our cabinet work because we have to deal with this on a regular, constant basis. Now, the adaptive leadership folks, Heifetz, Linsky, Williams, Grashow, I've been studying with them for a little while, and they would say this is good news for us, folks. This is good news for us, because they would say we now have an urgency that is going to propel the people to do something. And we have to stay with that. The way that they would describe this is, I've adapted this a little bit to our context, is if the conflict is too low, we're in the complacency zone. Nobody will do anything, and we've got a lot of churches there. If we ratchet it up too high, and it may be a little bit high now in terms of the social issues we're facing and the decline. But that's not productive because that's the panic zone. And people do what is called false urgency. They run around like chickens with their head cut off, not knowing what to do, and it's very seldom productive. And the adaptive leaders would say, what you gotta capitalize on is what they call the zone of productive disequilibrium. It's a bad title, but the ZPD. That is the sweet spot of change because you're motivating people to do something constructive. And if we are that non-anxious presence that could marshal this ZDP, then we might have a chance to change the direction of the whole church, at least change the direction of your annual conferences, your districts, and individual local churches. The ZDP is what we have to move to. And leadership has their finger on the thermostat that is controlling the conflict and temperature. And remember, try to get into the ZDP rather than any other zone. But Heifetz and Linsky would say, there are some things you've got to pay attention to. And one of those is how much conflict can you withstand as a leader? Test would be simple test. When conflict arises, will you naturally try to quell it, minimize it, endure it, or at least ignore it? Or will you fuel it in order to achieve a greater urgency on the paths of our constituencies? That's what they want us to do. And it takes courage to fuel it, or at least work with it. Marty and Ron do this better than almost anybody I know. I've experienced this a couple of times. If you go to one of their major workshops or experiences, they start out, the very first experience is a 2-hour session in which Marty and Ron will come down and they'll write simply on a whiteboard, where shall we begin? And then they say nothing the rest of the evening. Wow, you can imagine what happens. People are confused, they're anxious, they paid thousands of dollars for this workshop, and they're getting nothing. And immediately, leaders, I was with one group which had worldwide leaders from about 18 countries, about 180 of us. They started coming up to try to direct the group. And immediately, they're cut down by the group who says, who are you to tell us what to do? You know, what's wrong with this? And the chaos is just amazing. And impassively, Ron and Marty will just take it all in and never change expressions until the end of the evening where they say, good night, we'll talk about this tomorrow. That kind of courage to stand back and allow the pressure and the anxiety to raise to such a level is unbelievable. And all of us have this tendency to want to rush in and save the situation. That's why these leaders come up to try to salvage it. And how did they describe this? Ron and Marty say, they get executed by the group. They get assassinated by the group. And that's a good metaphor because Dean Williams, who has been an advisor, political advisors to small countries, says literally people die because of this pressure. So the whole idea is for us to hold the tension and not cave in to trying to save the situation, try to save the church, try to save whatever we're dealing with. We've got to let it ripen until the body emerges to do something. Next one. How many are willing to withstand casualties? Because they will point out there will always be casualties. And they're very sincere about this. They will tell you this all the time. There are going to be people who get hurt and exited in this process. And I think this is a tough one for our church because we want to save everybody. We want everybody to be involved. But the hard-boiled reality is that there are going to be casualties. And if you can't withstand that, then you can't be in the ZPD. You can't be an adaptive leader. And then the final one, how much loss can you tolerate? What are you willing to give up or lose in the change process? And that's a really important one because our loss tolerance has to be high. I know everybody in this room probably has that experience of that person who comes to you and says, unless you do it my way, I'm taking my money and leaving this situation, right? You've all had that. And it's not so much that they're leaving, it's the money that they want to emphasize that they're taking with them, right? And then when you call them on it, you find out, well, they didn't really give that much anyway. Speaks to our lack of faith, doesn't it? That somebody else will emerge with the money and the presence and getting rid of that bad DNA that is probably helpful for us. I think we really have to come to grips with the fact that there's going to be loss. Now, this is one of Ron's favorite diagrams, Ron Heifetz's favorite diagrams. This is a change diagram in terms of adaptive leadership, in which the past, present, and future are intimately entwined. And what he says, he's a medical doctor, so he talks about how evolution has to take place. And there's, in the past of our DNA, what we need to keep and what we need to give up. And in the present, it's all about adaptation and innovation for any species. In the process of adoption, some DNA will be left behind. And that's important for us to understand that if we have a future, we've got to give up some, but we've got to keep some. Now, here's the interesting thing. Ron will point out that the difference between the closest species to us as human beings is the chimpanzee. And Ron would say that the chimpanzee has 98% of the same DNA as we as human beings. Now, I later went back and researched this, and it's actually more like 96%, but I'm not going to tell Ron Heifetz that he's got the wrong stat. But it doesn't matter whether it's 96 or 98. His point is there's a 2 to 4% difference in DNA that has produced this huge evolutionary leap. It's remarkable that only 4% of DNA that is different between chimpanzees and us, and yet we've leaped evolutionarily way beyond that process. What do we keep and what do we give up? That's an important leadership question for you. For me, when I meet with interfaith groups, my non-negotiable is Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. I just put it on the table. I can't negotiate that. I'll talk with you. I'll dialogue you. That is my never giving up. And all the world religions that I interface with, they're cool with that. That's great, you know. We're not trying to convert you or anything. It's our Christianity folks who want to quibble over these things, right? So I would keep that, but I'd also keep our Wesleyan DNA, our history, doctrine, and theology, because I can't give that up as a United Methodist. And interesting enough, all the research shows that the younger generation, especially young evangelicals, are so captivated by Wesley if we can get them to hear what it's all about. I think our Wesleyan heritage is the key for younger generations to be captivated by our church. We have the product. Now we've got to get out to get them and let them hear what this product is. Now, there's a few other ones, and you got to figure this out. But what do we give up? I'm willing to give up almost anything in our church right now. Apportionments, the way we're doing it, I could give that up right now. Lifetime episcopacy, sign me up. I could give that one up, no problem. Guaranteed appointment, we got to find a way to give that one up, right? And yet, that's almost unfair because it's speaking to the choir. But the question for you personally is, what do you need to give up and what do you need to keep? And that's a critical question that all of us need to face in light of this situation. Now, my own field, organizational development and leadership, is really kind of flaky. I'm almost embarrassed by the literature that's out there. Now remember, Forbes says that it's a $70 billion a year industry in America and $120 billion worldwide every year for leadership initiatives and leadership development. And it's gone up 15% from last year. So there is separating the wheat from the chaff that we have to do. So what we have to realize is that a lot of leadership literature is trite and superficial and not worth really our time. And that's why I want to commend to you Gil Rendell's work, Be of Good Courage. Gil writes with his typical depth and really an analytical understanding and the wisdom to get us through some of the issues we face. So if you haven't read it, please pick that up. And another person I would recommend that I really enjoy is Barbara Kellerman out of Harvard. She's as comfortable with the great philosophers as she is with Harvard Business Review. And she sees the complexities of leadership from a deep understanding. So anything that Barbara writes, I would recommend. But for this issue, we have something greater than all the literature of the world, and that's our scripture. If we just turn to our scripture, we have all the basis of depth and wisdom that we need. And what I want to use is this particular scripture from 2 Corinthians. Will you join me in reading this? So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. We are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive good or evil according to what he has done in the body. 2 times, Paul says good courage, uses the term good courage. And he's tying good, the adjective, to courage, making the moral connection that courage arises out of strength of character, or what I would call integrity. Where does courage come from in a leadership literature? It comes from your character, who you are, your integrity as a person. And again, I've seen this happen in leadership circles, that the more courageous are those who have integrity really down. They know themselves and they know what they're about, and they don't let outside forces influence them. Now, Paul is showing his Christian Platonist hand with this because there's a dualism here. And the dualism really is earthly. We are both of these things. We are always in our bodies, but we're also always in the Lord. And we ride this tough dilemma. And when you really stop to think about this, Carl Holliday has this wonderful quote where he says, "The life of faith then by definition transcends bodily existence as it draws its sustaining power from the risen Lord, whom we know but cannot see except with the eyes of faith." We have it at our disposal. So Marty Linsky tells me, you have one thing, Grant, that all of the secular organizations don't have. And I said, "What's that, Marty?" And he said, "God." And he was quite serious. He said, "You and your fellow bishops have something that no secular leader can draw upon. And that's what's going to get you through. That's what Marty thinks is going to save us." Think about this. Courage comes from the suspension between the heavenly and the earthly realm. If we are heavenly bodies totally, we would fear nothing. We would fear absolutely nothing if we're a heavenly body, right? We would know God has it. On the other hand, if we're totally an earthly body without God, we should fear everything. And yet, this is our dilemma, our contradiction. We're caught between these two. True courage comes from this middle ground. Faithful, unfaithful, fearing nothing, fearing everything, having the integrity of Christ, compromising our integrity out of our insecurities. That's where courage comes from. And that's what I really want us to emphasize. We have God, and we need not fear anything because of God. Now, some practical realities really quickly. I think our great enemy is popularity. I think what we really struggle against in the end is wanting to be liked, wanting to be loved, wanting to belong. And popularity is not something that we need right now. We need courage, not popularity. We don't need people behind us or loving us or caring for us. So that's always good, but now is a time for moral courage. There's this wonderful play, Wicked, which many of you probably seen, and I'm going to share a little bit of a sample of that, in which Glinda, the good witch, is all about outward appearance and popularity, as opposed to the heroine of the story, Elphaba, who is struggling with this whole dilemma. So let me play this scene for you. All right, we'll try it one more time.
You're gonna be popular. I'll teach you the proper poise when you talk to boys. Little ways to flirt and glance. I'll show you what shoes to wear, how to fix that hair. Everything that really counts to be popular. I'll help you be popular. You'll hang with the right cohorts. You'll be good at sports. Know the slang you've got to know. So let's start, 'cause you've got an awfully long way to go. Don't be offended by my frank analysis. Think of it as personality dialysis. Now that I've chosen to become a palimpsest or an advisor, there's nobody wiser. Not when it comes to popular. I know about popular, and with an assist from me to be who you'll be instead of dreary who you were, well, are. There's nothing that can stop you from becoming popular. La, la, la. We're gonna make you popular. When I see depressing creatures with unprepossessing features, I remind them on their own behalf to think of celebrated heads of state or specially great communicators. Did they have brains or knowledge? Don't make me laugh. They were popular. Please. It's all about popular. It's not about aptitude. It's the way you're viewed. So it's very shrewd to be very, very popular. Like me. This is never going to work.
Okay, so we contrast that with Elphaba, those of you who know the story, who must find the internal courage not to be popular. She even goes against the wizard, which makes her very unpopular, but she does the right thing. And she could go back. Glinda asks her, come back to the wizard. And she knows she cannot do that. To make the change necessary, to be that moral voice, she must have the courage to be who she is. This is so seductive, popularity, and you all know what's at stake here. To be popular will not change our church, but it will cement the status quo, and we don't have a future. The other practical courage that we need is the courage to fail, and to fail often. IDEO's famous words, the secular innovation company, is fail early and fail often. Because in failure, we learn the greatest amount that we could. And our problem is not that we fail. It's the problem that we don't share all the learnings from our failure. We're not a true learning organization where information goes up and down the organization. And from all your experiments, we don't hear what you've learned to help us in the next iteration. But we've got to fail. It's a time of innovation and experimentation, as Bishop O started with. This is the time where we have to get out there and do all kinds of experiments, and there will be failure. And in our risk-averse culture, we've got to make it okay that you're not punished when you fail, but in fact, you will be praised because of what you learn from it. So failure is our greatest resource in this sense. It's going to take courage for appointment making, and that is courageous missional appointment making. And that's what we have to be about. We have to get the absolutely best person, best spiritual leader to the context of that community and church. And you know, we've got this constraint called guaranteed appointment that we're going to have the courage to stand against. And this harkens back to Colin's favorite expression, get the right people on the bus, the wrong people off the bus, and the right people in the right seats. We are going to have the courage to make appointments that go against the popular way, that which would make people happy. We are here to do missional appointments. Now, Bishop Mike Lowry and I have this diagram that we use. And actually, before I say that, I do want to say one thing about Bishop Lowry, and that is we came in the same class, Mike and I, and we didn't know each other from Adam. And we were in this hokey icebreaker at the new bishop's orientation where we first met. And when we found out we're both from Illinois, that's why he's a Cubs fan, and I'm secretly a Cubs fan. And and Mike and I are probably the exact extremes on a theological expression. We are totally on opposite ends of a theological and social spectrum. We differ about everything except that which really matters, and that is our faith in Jesus Christ and our love for the church. And we don't talk about our differences. We talk about our commonalities and passion. We talk about growing churches and creating new places for new people and all the things that really matter. And because of that, we have a bond of friendship that no social issue will ever come between. Now, I say that because that gives me hope for the church. Hope that the way forward on this great issue of homosexuality and the other issues that we have before us can be managed because of my relationship to one person as an example. And I pray that this will be true for all of us. This is our values priority that we work on, and this is a servant leadership model that we believe is so critical. God is the main source of our inspiration and our appointment making. Without that affirmation from God, forget it. Next down on the value priority is the kingdom of God through the mission field. That has to be our next priority. Not the church, it's the mission field. It's all those outside of our midst. And then we have the local church and the laity as the next rung down. And then the clergy. They are servant leaders, called in their covenant to be servant leaders. And then finally, the annual conference, the cabinet, and the bishop. We're at the bottom of this. We are to make appointments based upon this value system. And when we do it this way, then we are right with God and our appointments flow. Do you have a similar type of value system? The moral courage to use something that directs all of your attention and all of your priorities. All right. Here's our failure one. Keeps us humble, but also on edge. Doesn't crush us, but makes us hungry and more motivated. We learn more and more when we fail. Nike does this advertising better than anybody in the world, and here's one example of how they do this.
I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life. And that is why I succeed.
Gosh, if we had that advertising, we would change the world. Let me close with an example for you. Council of Bishops is a cultural icon. It's a culture that has a history all its own, a staid culture that has greatness in it, but also some issues. And Bishop Paul Leland led our new bishops orientation. He had a great line to the new bishops. He said, at your first council meeting, you're going to walk around and you're going to say to yourself, how did I get here? And then he said, after a number of meetings and getting to know all of us, you're going to walk around the room and say, how did they get here? I thought that was a wonderful example that Paul blessed us with. But you know this culture is one of decades and centuries of history. And there was a cultural tradition among the Council of Bishops that every bishop at General Conference would sign on with the episcopal address, and the bishop that was chosen to give that address. Every bishop had to put their signature on. And one of our saints in the College of Bishops for the West, but also I think the Council of Bishops, is Mel Wheatley. And one year this happened, and the address was denouncing LGBTQ people. And Mel could not sign. He refused to sign. And the pressure was on him, the peer pressure. Do you know how much courage it takes to stand against the entire council? Unbelievable pressure. But that was Mel. He stood for what was right with integrity, that which took courage. And you know what? The next General Conference, no longer did all the bishops have to sign on to the episcopal address and the bishop giving that address. The witness of one person changed that staid culture. The courage to stand provided that change. And if that could take place in the Council of Bishops, it can certainly take place in our church. Where do you need to stand to change your annual conference, your local church, your district, the entire denomination? Let me close with this. An admirer once asked a paratrooper how many jumps he had made, and the paratrooper said he hadn't made any. Astonished, the admirer said, well, how can you call yourself a paratrooper then? To which he replied, oh, I'm a paratrooper, all right, and it's true, I've made no jumps, but I've been pushed out of the airplane 47 times. Let us hope we're pushed out of the airplane. Only then will we soar. Thank you. We are going to close pretty quickly. There was one, if I can get the PowerPoint up one more time, what 4% difference can you make in the general church, your annual conference, your district, or your local church? So we wanted you to at least have some time to chew on with each other. What small percentage of difference would make this huge leap for us in terms of change and direction? So if we could take a very short time for you just to go ahead and have a table conversation about this issue. Testing. Okay. We want to thank you we know you're all tired, and we know that we're going to call the evening a little earlier, and so we want to thank you, and I want to bring Bishop Lowry back up for some quick announcements, and then we'll finish with worship. So have a good sleep and a restful evening.